again? Okay, there we go. I don't have to shout the whole time. First off, I want to apologize. I'm a fiddler. Not that I don't play the fiddle, but I mean, I constantly tinker with things, and last night I decided I didn't like this outline. All the quotes are still good. The quotes are still good, but the outline, I don't know, it was about 10:30 last night, and I want to do something different. So this is point one of the new real outline. I want to kind of go back, pause for a moment, and talk a little bit about what churches looked like at the end of the First Great Awakening, before the Revolution, to help us make sense of some of the decisions that were being made politically about things. Okay, so before the First Great Awakening, 90% of the churches in the Americas, in British North America, were either the Church of England or the congregational churches like the Puritans in New England. Okay, so 90% either Church of England or the Puritans, which only leaves 10% for Presbyterians, Quakers. There's no Methodists yet, but that's it, right? By 1770, right, so at the time that the First Great Awakening has kind of run its course, we're getting ready to move into the American Revolution period of time, right? There's been protests over some British taxes and things. The actual firing starts 1775. What does things look like at that point with churches? 20% of churches were congregational Puritan churches. 15% were Church of England, Anglican churches. 18% were Presbyterian. 15% were English or Welsh Baptists. Around 10% were Quakers. Around 10% were German Lutheran. Around 10% were German Reformed. The diversity then has expanded, right? We start with 90% that are Anglican or congregational, and then only 35% are those two groups. There have been some dramatic changes in those 70 years. Right? And it's all thanks to that First Great Awakening. Now, what is that? Oh, and one other little note, and I think this is important with how we think about early America and diversity. 25% of the churches were not English-speaking. English has not always been, I mean, the 75% is still the majority, but 25% is a significant something else, right? Oh, it's gone now. It just disappeared? Is it just me? It's still there. Okay. It's all in my head. It's fine. Right, so 25% speaking something else. German was one of the largest groups. In fact, the first Bible printed in British North America was a German Bible, modeled off after Martin Luther's translation of the Bible. So first Bible printed here in what would become the United States was a German Bible, not an English Bible. Now what does that kind of look like with a map? It's hard to see, but just like with last week, if you really wanted to like zoom in and look at things closer, they'll post the PowerPoints on the YouTube so you can see. Every color is a different denominational group. And so you can see how they're kind of spread out throughout the different colonies. When I kind of look at it, look at all the yellow. Right? Those are the Presbyterians. Many of them Scots-Irish immigrants come. They settle kind of in all different colonies and places. So despite the fact that they are only about 18% of the churches, they're one of the ones that's kind of represented most widely throughout the different colonies. It's one of the reasons why many Presbyterian ministers are going to be some of the early leaders in the Second Great Awakening. It's because of they're some of the ones that are out there. Something else that happens during the Revolutionary era is what is usually called disestablishment. Most of the colonies had an official church that was supported by tax dollars. So in the southern colonies, Maryland, Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, that was the Church of England. So people paid taxes, and some of that money went to pay the minister's salary, went to pay for the upkeep of the church building. What happens if you were a Baptist in Virginia? You paid the taxes, and they went to the local Anglican church. Then you had to pay any, additional offerings for the Baptist minister in church that you might want to attend. Back in England, you could be persecuted, thrown in jail, sometimes tortured or executed, if you attended a different church than the official Church of England. In the colonies, sometimes that happened early on, but by the time of the Revolution, it was not common, the taxes. So you paid those religious taxes. In New England, it was congregational churches that got the tax money. So once again, if you were a Baptist in Massachusetts, your tax money went to support the local Puritan church. You had no say in it whatsoever. To many at the Revolutionary era, right, as they're complaining about taxes that they have no say in, that Parliament or the King says you've got to pay these, and we're not represented in Parliament, we don't have a say in this, and there's rebellion, it made sense to disestablish churches. Why is my money being taken and given to a church that maybe I do or don't support? So in 1776, Maryland and North Carolina disestablished the church, stopped handing over tax money to the local Church of England. Georgia did the same thing the next year in 1777. After the Revolutionary War, the process continued with Virginia in 1785, thanks to Thomas Jefferson, kind of took the lead, wrote a big document about religious liberty in the new state of Virginia and what that meant. And then South Carolina in 1790. It's the Puritan churches in New England that were the slowest to disestablish. Massachusetts was the last in 1833. A very long period of time before this process kind of came to a close. But so there's this trend then among the so-called founding fathers or the revolutionary generation that religion and the church needs to kind of stand on its own. Right? No, we're not going to support the churches with tax dollars. Now, some of that was because it's England, far away. What if it's local? That becomes a debate then at the time of the Constitution. We'll kind of get to it in a minute. But then when the Revolution is over and the colonists have been successful in their rebellion, there is chaos in the Church of England. Many, if not almost all of the ministers in the Church of England left, either during the Revolution or in the immediate aftermath, because part of their ordination was taking an oath of fealty to the King of England. If you're now in a country that was in open rebellion and is now independent, how do you fulfill those oaths of allegiance if you're in a place that's gone? Right? So most of them had been resistant to the revolution and preached sermons against it. Imagine how that would go in Virginia. If you were in like the church that Washington or Jefferson might attend, you've got revolutionary leaders that have been a part of your congregation and you want to preach a God Save the King sermon? Like that's probably not going to go over well. Right? So many of these men, they just leave. They go back to England, some go up to Canada, there's a crisis in the Anglican Church. What are they going to do? Are they even going to exist? There were some Anglican churches that had been influenced by John Wesley. Right? He had sent over and licensed certain preachers like Francis Asbury to come, Thomas Coke. And so they had already been traveling throughout many of the colonies, delivering sermons. Things in 1784, Wesley wrote a letter to Francis Asbury. And Wesley had not been a supporter of the American Revolution, but in 1784 it's done. And he's like, well, you're a new country now. You might as well be independent. Like Wesley himself never left the Anglican Church. Right? He remained within the Church of England his entire life. But that didn't make sense for the ministers that he had licensed and sent to America. Right? So he basically told Asbury and co, look, you're on your own, and the Methodist Episcopal Church was created then in 1784. So some in the Church of England followed that route. Others that weren't as enamored with Wesley and some of his ideas eventually organized themselves in 1790 into the Episcopal Church, the Protestant Episcopal Church of the United States. Right, so in 1790 they got organized, but the Episcopal Church never regained like the level of membership and status that the Church of England had had in the colonies. Right, so it took a little while. Some become Methodists, some become Episcopals. But then there's also this, what I've decided to call a distancing from religion, which I think helps explain this idea of the separation of church and state and why it became a thing in the Constitution. Historians have tried to estimate the number of church members in the decade or so after the Revolution. They looked at a lot of church records, and the best estimates that I could find was about 1 in 10 Americans were church members. But most of the estimates that I've seen are about 1 in 20. So the couple of decades after the Revolution, there's almost this distancing from at least church membership. Now, some of that has some theological reasons, I think, for why, which I'll get to here in a minute. But the Constitutional Convention that met in the 1780s, 1787, had some questions to kind of think about in trying to reframe the government of the United States. The government was operating under something called the Articles of Confederation, which had been created during the American Revolution, but wasn't working very well as far as a national government goes. There was no president, no executive branch at all, no judicial branch. There was only the legislative branch of one house. And it didn't really matter the population of the state. Every state got one vote. And any significant changes had to be unanimous. Can you imagine trying to get a unanimous vote in the Senate? Now, for anything like that's about impossible to think of. It's one reason why people turn to this secret constitutional convention to try to figure out something different. Because any even small changes required almost a Herculean effort to get things made. So, Constitutional Convention, though, had to figure out what kind of a nation are we going to be? What's going to be the foundation? If you read the Constitution, God is not in there. Right? The Creator, nature's God, gets mentioned in the Declaration of Independence. There's a few places where Thomas Jefferson and Adams and Franklin that played a role in the creation of the Declaration, that there's some religious language in there. But in the Constitution itself, there's nothing. There's just maybe like one reference that no religious test can be created to qualify someone to run for office. And if we think about the diversity that exists, right, that's, I think, one of those reasons why you get no religious test. Because how do you decide which group of Christians is going to be okay? Right, so I want to pause for a moment. We are products of the 21st century, right? I don't want to take a poll, but if I asked you to raise your hand, how many of you think the Presbyterians in town are going to hell? I bet there's probably not a lot of hands that would get raised. Right? Is that fair? Okay, in 1800, it would be almost universal. If you thought Presbyterians were going to heaven, you'd be a Presbyterian. right? The reason you'd be a Methodist is because you thought this is it, right? There's no kind of ecumenical sense that we're all Christians just trying to figure this out and do our best. That's a product of the 20th century, right? The ecumenical movement, different Christian groups began working together. That is not the case through most of Christian history, right? There's lots of animosity. And so I just kind of like keep that in mind for this. So if you've got founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson, okay, well, I don't know how to say this either. This is not the right word to use. None of the founding fathers would have been considered normal Christians. Right? Maybe conventional is a better word. They would not fit into little easy boxes with their beliefs and practices. And so I think because of that, they're educated, they know what churches are like, they know some things about different denominations. How do you decide which group is best? Which group should you support? The solution is none, right? For a few other kinds of reasons that I'll get to in a minute. But the First Amendment then, right, not part of the original Constitution, but one of the difficulties in getting the Constitution ratified was that at no point in time are specific rights listed in the Constitution. And for some people, like Patrick Henry, if you remember that name, give me liberty or give me death, he hated the Constitution, right, at least in its initial form. He fought against it in Virginia to try to keep the state of Virginia from ratifying it because he thought it gave away too much power to the federal government and did not protect individual rights. So in order to get the Constitution ratified, James Madison, and he was really the main writer of the Constitution in kind of bold fashion, basically had to promise, hey, one of the first things Congress will do is pass some amendments that guarantee rights. So one of those is the First Amendment, freedom of religion, where it says, make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now, what exactly that has meant has been debated and fought over a lot. But not a whole lot before the Civil War. There was a lot that was just kind of taken for granted. But now, Thomas Jefferson got a letter when eventually he became president. He won the election of 1800. And so 1801, he's officially inaugurated as president. And later that year, he got a letter from some Baptist ministers who were very concerned that persecution of Baptists would continue, especially in places like New England, where the Congregational church is still established. They're still having to pay taxes. They want to know if the new government, that's still just a couple presidents old, what's going to happen to their rights as Baptists and what this First Amendment really means. And this is where Thomas Jefferson uses that phrase, the separation of church and state. That no, what the First Amendment does is erect this wall to separate the two. No, you're not going to be persecuted. You're not going to continue to be taxed. It's going to take time, because eventually, right, with the federal government doing something is one thing. States might do something else. But one of the reasons that disestablishment continues to happen is not just because of the revolutionary ideology of freedom and no taxes, but also because there's a kind of a trickle-down effect. If it's not right for the federal government to tax to support a church, why is it right for a state to do so? And eventually, every state decides it's not right to do so. And they look back at this and the language that Jefferson uses for this. There are kind of three arguments that were used for this separation of church and state. And part of the first one comes from Jefferson himself. when he is writing this document on religious liberty for Virginia that helps them create this religious Bill of Rights that just established the Church of England in Virginia, he basically says it's the natural right of every person to decide for themselves when it comes to religion. I totally messed up. There aren't any forms from last week that are here, right? There's a great quote, if you still have it, look back at it. There's a great quote where he's like, what does it matter if my neighbor believes in one God or 20 gods or no gods? It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my legs. He has a very kind of like practical approach to it, right? It's the individual right for every person to decide for themselves. And he did for himself. Have you heard of the Jefferson Bible? I purchased a facsimile version that the Smithsonian put out. He cut out verses from Bibles to create one of the first interlinear texts. So the far left column is Greek, next is Latin, then French, then English. He created his own gospel. He didn't call it the Bible. He called it the life and morals of Jesus of Nazareth, extracted textually from the Gospels in Greek, Latin, French, and English. This is the end of his book. It's the burial of Jesus. There's no resurrection. If you read through most of it, there's no miracles. That's why he calls it the life and morals of Jesus. He thought Jesus was great, really smart, taught good life lessons. But the idea of the Trinity, he called that twisted math. How can 3 be 1 and 1 be 3? Like, that's not how math works. He thought most of that was ridiculous. But he followed at least what he thought this kind of code of virtue that Jesus taught. Well, if you ignore sleeping with slaves and things like that, that's something different, apparently. But I mean, not really, but he didn't think about that at the time, I guess. So, like Jefferson, every individual. And that's why there should be separation of church and state. Because how can the government interfere with individual conscience? Right? You should be able to choose. Government shouldn't mess around with that. Another reason is tied to a Baptist minister named Isaac Backus. Backus had worked in Virginia. Backus had worked up in New England. And he was a strong supporter of the separation of church and state. Because everywhere he was working, there was an established church. And it was never the Baptist church. Right? So from his perspective, government involvement in religion was always bad for religion. It made the church worse. It made the church corrupt. So the best way to strengthen the church was to separate church and state. Just get the government out. Third kind of reason for the separation comes from James Madison. As he's working on the Constitution, he was one of the first speakers of the House of Representatives that helped pass the First Amendments and get those through Congress. Madison is like, how do we pick? It is too diverse to support just one. We pick Presbyterians. They're 20%, but then you got 80% of the people upset and angry and fighting. Like, you can't pick one. It's too diverse. So Jefferson and Backus and Madison all argued for something like we would call the marketplace of ideas. The United States government was going to be out of the religious business, and it would be up to those religions themselves to kind of figure things out. You want to grow? You got to figure out how to do it without the government putting a check in your pocket. All right, so here is new outline point number 2. Some introductory aspects of the Second Great Awakening. I didn't want to type out the whole Second Great Awakening that time. I was running out of room. there at the top of the slide. First, we got to talk a little theology. I'm sorry, I know maybe you came for history, but we got to talk a little theology, a couple different things. First, the Calvinism for the time. And I think this also explains why it was difficult to become a church member. It's very different from once again, being in the 21st century in many denominations. If you were a Presbyterian or in a congregational area, in their Calvinist system, right, not everyone can be saved. God has predestined certain individuals before the creation of the world to go to heaven and others to go to hell. You might not know whether you're saved or they would use language like one of the elect or not. But maybe at some point in your life you'd have a conversion experience where you were struck by the Holy Spirit and you would know, the Holy Spirit has touched me. I must be one of the elect. You had to be able to tell and articulate that story to the congregation. And in many of these churches, then they got to take a vote to decide if they thought your story was legitimate or not, or if you just had some kind of fake emotional experience to a sermon. So your membership could be rejected if you could not cleanly articulate a conversion moment. I think that's one reason why membership declined. I also think it's one reason why there were more women members in churches than male members. Women had an exit clause because they were, I gotta be careful of that, because they were lowly women. They didn't have to present their story. They could tell their story to the minister, and the minister would present it on their behalf. So if you could convince the minister that you'd had a conversion moment, he's going to be able to get the job done, right? And so I think with the code of masculinity at the time, it's a little bit embarrassing for a man to stand in front of a congregation trying to defend themselves and then maybe get rejected. So it was less common for men to apply for membership in many of these. And it's because salvation is not open to everyone. God has predestined certain people, and the church needs to figure out who those people are. Okay, so that's part of the theological system that exists at the time, which, I gotta be honest with you, was not super appealing to Americans after the American Revolution. They had just won a war against the greatest army and navy that the world had seen to that time. Like even Americans at the time realized that this was a miracle. This shouldn't have happened. And it must mean that God is on the American side. America is destined for something special. They talked about this all the time. So there's a lot of optimism, a lot of hopefulness. This kind of Calvinism is a little bit depressing. It's a little bit pessimistic about things. You mean I can't do something to be saved? No, it's all up to God. God does it all. So that kind of strict Calvinism, not interesting to a lot of people. There's also post-millennialism. This is like a giant can of worms, but okay, so is Christ going to reign for a literal 1,000 years on earth? Scripture kind of talks about the millennium, this 1,000-year period of time. There's a couple different options. There's pre-millennialism, that the world is going to get worse and worse. You've got all the horrible things that are going to happen. At the very bottom, Christ of this time, Christ will return, put everything right, rule over earth for 1,000 literal years, and then there's heaven after that. That's pre-millennialism. A little bit depressing and pessimistic about human nature. Things are just going to continue to slide into darkness until Christ steps in. Post-millennialism, a little bit more optimistic. World is going to get better and improve. That's the job of the church. Church needs to make the world better, and eventually when the world has been conquered by Christ, that is when he returns. It's an allegorical and metaphorical millennium of time as the church grows and spreads around the world, and when every knee is bowing to Christ, then that's when he comes back to earth. A bit more hopeful, optimistic. Guess which one appealed to Americans after the Revolution? Yeah, post-millennialism. It's been more, it seems to like fit this this new expansion of this country. There's a lot more excitement towards that kind of stuff. So when I talk about this time period, in about the 1800s on, and the Second Great Awakening, I talk about 3 keys to understanding. And the first is what I call volunteerism. Because there's no established church, people have to volunteer to come to your church. So you've got to be, this doesn't have to sound crass. You have to be appealing. Right? If you just stand and say, you're going to hell. Yes, there's some people that will be attracted to that, but a lot of people will be like, I got your hell right here. Right? And move on. And so churches begin to make an effort. This sounds materialistic, but it doesn't have to be that way. You want to be appealing. So you have a beautiful building. You start to see stained glass. The use of instruments like pipe organs. Very rare before 1800. Now some of that has to do with money. Churches don't have a lot of money, right? Even ones that are supported by the government don't always have a lot. So you want appealing preaching and telling people that there's nothing they can do because you've either been predestined to heaven or predestined to hell. That is not an appealing message. So Calvinism gets softened in some of the denominations, like the Presbyterians that were diehard Calvinists begin to go, well, maybe it's not all predestination. Then there are other groups that completely reject predestination in that kind of a concept. So volunteerism. People have to volunteer to come to your church because they can't be forced to. It's part of that free market of ideas. Pluralism. It's the diversity. Right? There is no dominant denomination. There's some that might be larger than others. But if there's a Presbyterian church in town, they can't keep the Methodists out. Right? The sheriff can't meet them at the road into town and say, sorry, we're all Presbyterians here. Mr. Asbury, Mr. Dow, you've got to move on down the road somewhere else. Like, that can't happen legally. Right? So all of these groups have to find ways to exist with each other, but they are in competition with each other. They have Sunday school competitions. This is one of my favorites. You try and round up as many kids as you can. They advertise. Like we had, 350 people show up for our VBS, and they only had 200. We never do. No one ever does that kind of stuff. No, oh wait, yes, it happens. Just drive around town enough and look at the church signs after VBS season, and you'll see a lot of. I gotta focus. Okay, so early leaders in the Second Great Awakening. Because 10:30, that's when I'm supposed to stop, right?
Yes.
Have you all ever been at a sporting event where the crowd tries to get the wave started? Yeah, the Second Great Awakening was kind of like that. There's a bunch of little mini revivals that kind of pop out. There would be a revival that pops up in the church, but then it kind of dies out and doesn't really do anything. So there's a whole bunch of that kind of stuff going on. The big one that historians usually point to is the one in Cane Ridge, Kentucky in 1801. And that's the first quote, I'm finally to a quote on the blue sheet, is from Barton Stone, who was a Presbyterian minister there in Cane Ridge. The church of Cane Ridge is still in existence, the building. You can go visit it at a museum there. So Barton Stone hosted this revival that historians have named America's Pentecost because it seemed to kick things off. Thousands of people came. Cane Ridge, Kentucky was a frontier town, right? So thousands of people came and camped for weeks to hear preaching from multiple different ministers. It wasn't just Presbyterians that were there. It's lots of different groups. And so he says, and this is where the quote, the little snippet for everything, he talks about a lot of people being worried that there's not a lot of people going to church anymore. Religion was in danger. The humble Christians prayed fervently and sang the praises of God with warm devotion. Their prayers reached the ears of the Lord. He answered by fire, for he poured out his Spirit in a way almost miraculous. Right, so they were praying for revival for the nation, and revival hit. Now, the big quote at the bottom that goes over to the other page, there were these, he called them spiritual exercises. All kinds of unusual things that happened there at Cane Ridge. The falling exercise, people would be struck by the Spirit and fell down on the ground like they were dead. They could not be woken up. That could last an hour, that could last 24 hours. The jerks having spasms, my favorite, I can't even imagine doing it, but they would rock back and forth, touching their forehead to the ground in front and then behind, like one of those bobbing birds, but uncontrollably. The dancing exercise was apparently something just for ministers, so we should ask the reverends here to break out a holy dance. The barking exercise, the uncontrollable grunts and noises that people made often when they had the jerks. The laughing exercise, that's one of my favorites, just filled with uncontrollable laughter. The running exercise, people got freaked out and tried to run away. They would get a certain way out from the camp, and then usually they'd get hit by the falling exercise. Couldn't wake back up. My favorite, though, is the singing. I can't even imagine what this is like. They would be singing hymns, but not from their mouths, from their chests. Like their heart itself within them was singing out Amazing Grace. Now, I put the lyrics to Amazing Grace down there. That's an older hymn than the Second Great Awakening, but it becomes an American hymn during the Second Great Awakening. It's used constantly by Baptist and Methodist ministers traveling around on their preaching circuits because of the emotional power and story of that hymn. So even though it was written in the 1770s, it was kind of forgotten in England. But it gets resurrected by ministers here because of the emotional power. And Barton Stone didn't know what to do with these things. He records them. He doesn't pass judgment on them. But he doesn't have an explanation for them either. Like, they happen. This has to be God's answering by fire. Right? There's no other explanation for it. You all probably are familiar with these couple of people, Francis Asbury, Peter Cartwright, what amazing figures they are in the early history of the Second Great Awakening. Francis Asbury, by the time he died in 1816, had ridden around 300,000 miles. His preaching circuits had crossed the Appalachian Mountains over 50 times, had traveled as far north as Canada, had probably seen more of North America than any other person during his time. Peter Cartwright, he's a fun example to me, another one that traveled a ton like Asbury did. Cartwright arrived in town and a Presbyterian minister complained, like, we're all good here, you should go somewhere else. And his response was, the people were a free people that lived in a free country and must be allowed to do as they pleased. Lorenzo Dow, I'll end with these two here. Lorenzo Dow is one of my favorites. What a weird guy. He did not bathe, he did not shave, traveled thousands and thousands of miles, and he was also challenged by a Presbyterian minister when he arrived in a town and gave an anti-Calvinism sermon. And the minister said, you don't even know what Calvinism is. Like, you're talking about Calvinism, but you don't know what it is. And Dow responded with this. I know what Calvinism is. Calvinism is, you can and you can't. You shall and you shan't. You will and you won't. And you'll be damned if you do, and you'll be damned if you don't. I have always wanted to know, like, did he think of that on the spot? Or did he, like, carry that in his back pocket? Like, I wait until I'm heckled by Presbyterians, and I will drop this. That's a mic drop moment from the 1800s. Jarena Lee was in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which was officially started in 1816, and that's when she felt God was calling her to preach. But she resisted it at first because she was convinced it was Satan. She's like, not today, Satan. You're not going to get me to go to hell because I preached a sermon. And eventually she realized, oh, it's not Satan. I think this really is God. And her answer was, if the man may preach because the Savior dies for him, why not the woman, seeing he died for her also? Is he not a whole Savior instead of half of one? So eventually the head bishop of the AME church ordained her, sent her, and she traveled thousands of miles herself preaching at AME churches north and south, which was very dangerous for a free black woman, because at that time, with the way the Fugitive Slave Acts works, she could be claimed to have been a runaway slave and arrested and enslaved. So kind of like double danger with things. These are very dramatic figures. But each of them also rejectors of traditional Calvinism. So their message is appealing. You can accept God's call to salvation. It's available to everyone. All you have to do is say yes. Just say yes. Right? It's an appealing message then. And it's one of the reasons why the Methodist Church becomes the largest denomination in the U.S. in the 1800s. It's at least partially because of that rejection of Calvinism, the more openness, optimistic approach to human beings and their ability to say yes to salvation. Not that human beings aren't earning, no one ever says that they're earning their salvation, but it's a gift. Say yes to the gift. God's trying to give you the gift. Just say yes. Right? And they're heroic figures, right? They are putting their lives on the line to travel these distances. We kind of take for granted that whatever town we might go to, there's going to be churches there. That's not the case in the 1800s America. Right? This is a growing nation, and there's not always churches organized. So these people are traveling to frontier areas that may not have an established church yet. And so I think I'll end with this. Everyone at the time would have rejected the notion of America being a Christian nation. One of the other quotes from last week on the outline was from John Adams as president, signed a treaty with the Muslim nation of Tripoli in North Africa. And one of the statements in the treaty in 1797 said, of course the United States is not founded in any way on Christian principles. Now that took some people in the U.S. by surprise. What do you mean, not in any way? But they didn't change the treaty. It was still accepted and ratified by the Senate with that language in it. But we became a nation of Christians in the Second Great Awakening. And there's a difference. There's a difference between being a Christian nation and a nation full of Christians. At least they thought so at the time. Okay, I'll stop here for today, because we've got one more, so I can finish up. Any questions?
You can take 2 or 3 questions.
2 or 3 questions, I'll call 2 or 3 questions. Thank you. Yes.
Will they be seeing a dance?
Not for me. No. My dancing days are done. I never had any dancing days.
Thank you.